Hi everyone. Welcome to Unit 11, Indian Development Experience. Course, OSS 101 Preparatory Course in Social Sciences. Objectives of this course is to discuss the growth path of the Indian economy, identify the initial constraints faced by the economy, explain the limitations of the command and control policy, explain the circumstances under which the new economic policy was launched. Find out the challenges to be overcome by the Indian economy. Here is a mind map diagram on Indian development experience. You can pause the video here to view it in detail. In recent years, India has been able to achieve a growth rate of about 6% per annum in gross domestic product (GDP) for the period 1991-92 to 2006-07. If India could sustain this growth rate, its GDP will double every 12 years. Such an achievement is considered to be very good by world standards. There are rapid technological developments in the country in many fields, and we see Indian professionals excelling in many parts of the world. There is an increase in Indian exports to foreign countries, leading to a rise in foreign exchange reserve. Alongside this, rapid investments industries are taking place. On the whole, there is an atmosphere of dynamism and optimism in the country. These developments in India are somewhat new. Hardly 2 decades back, India was considered as an economy in deep crisis. Economic growth was sluggish. Foreign exchange reserve was abysmally low, public debt was quite high, and many industrial units were running at a loss. Indian economy is often compared with an elephant, large in size and slow to react. Interestingly, when the elephant moves, it creates a strong impact. The real turnaround in growth and technological development coincide with a series of economic liberalization measures initiated in 1991. This leads many us to believe that economic reforms in India has been successful. There are, however, certain deep-rooted problems in the Indian economy that get sidelined when we see the growth performance. Here is a mind map diagram on colonial legacy, initial constraints. You can pause the video here to view it in detail. At the time of independence, India was in a precarious position. Agriculture was backward, industry had hardly come up, there was large-scale illiteracy as well as ill health. Most people were ignorant of modern ideas. There was widespread poverty and malnutrition. Infrastructure such as roads, railways, power and telecommunication were not developed. There were very few schools and colleges, mostly in urban areas. People did not have access to health facilities, as a result of which life expectancy was very low. You can imagine the extent of backwardness from the fact that in 1951 only 18.3% population was literate, life expectancy was 32 years, and per capita income was less than 1/3 of today's level. Per capita income of India was one of the lowest in the world. At that time, agriculture was the backbone of the economy. Agriculture contributed 60% of GDP in 1950-51, while industries contributed only 13%. Production technology was obsolete, tilling was through bullock power, cow dung was used as manure, irrigation facility was non-existent except in few pockets, and locally available seeds were used for cultivation. In such environment, yield per hectare of land was low. Most of the workforce was employed in agriculture. Industry had hardly developed. On the whole, the standard of living of people was low. Due to low income, people were not in a position to save. Funds were not available for investment. Moreover, there were very few entrepreneurs who could take the risk of undertaking investment. In the year 1951, savings was about 10% of GDP compared to 29% today, in 2005-06. The division of the country into India and Pakistan created widespread social turmoil and displacement of people. It also had led to imbalances in supply of goods, particularly food grains. The immediate task before the newly formed Indian government was to restore supply of necessary commodities and to rehabilitate the displaced persons. Moreover, India needed to grow as fast as possible. The task was enormous before the planners: creation of a strong workforce through imparting education, provision of health facilities to people, setting up of industries to provide modern amenities, and development of infrastructure such as roads, railways, power plants, telecommunication, etc. The constraints were equally forceful: lack of funds, poverty and illiteracy of the masses, and shortage of technology to exploit the available resources. Here is a mind map diagram on 5-year plans, the vehicle of growth. You can pause the video here to view it in detail. India started economic planning in 1951 in the form of 5-year plans. The basic objective was to accelerate growth rate and give a direction to the development path. At that point of time, Russia, erstwhile USSR, had successfully implemented five-year plans and realized high growth rates. This provided incentives to leaders such as Jawaharlal Nehru to draw lessons from Russia and pursue five-year plans in India. India followed the policy of a mixed economy where private sector and public sector coexisted. The objective of the first five-year plan, 1951-52 to 1955-56, was very modest. It tried to consolidate the economy, which was ravaged by the division of the country in 1947 and the Indo-Pak War in 1948. With this objective in mind, the first five-year plan emphasized agricultural development by bringing in more area under cultivation, increasing area under irrigation, and resettlement of displaced families. While the target was set at a modest 1.5% per annum growth rate in GDP, the realized growth rate was 3.6% per annum. The enthusiasm of the planners can be judged from the fact that India had just come out of nearly 5 decades-long period, 1901 to 1947, of stagnancy in production. The more than expected performance of the first five-year plan made the policymakers more optimistic and set higher goals for the second first five-year plan, 1956-57 to 1960-61. The second five-year plan was more elaborate and larger in size, in terms of investments, than the first five-year plan. As we will see below, the second five-year plan created the groundwork for development of a socialist pattern of society. The principal objectives of the second five-year plan were: sizable increase in national income so that standard of living of people can be raised. Rapid industrialization with emphasis on basic and heavy industries. Expansion of employment opportunities. Reduction in inequalities in income and wealth. The second plan document stated that these objectives were to be pursued in a balanced way, for excessive emphasis on any one of them might damage the economy and delay the realization of the other objectives. In fact, the above four objectives were maintained in the subsequent five-year plans also. However, the emphasis shifted from one objective to another as India proceeded from one five-year plan to another. While the first five-year plan put emphasis on agriculture, the second five-year plan, 1956-61, and the third five-year plan, 1961-66, emphasized more on industrialization, particularly on heavy industries. While the 1950s was a decade of hope and optimism, the 1960s was a decade of despair. During the 1960s, India had to tackle several crises: the Indochina War of 1962, the Indo-Pak War of 1965, the severe droughts of 1965-66 and 1966-67. India lost two successive prime ministers, Jawaharlal Nehru 1964 and Lal Bahadur Shastri in 1966. Moreover, the performance of the third five-year plan was very poor, a meager 2.8% per annum, compared to earlier plans. All these developments prompted the policymakers to delay the launch of the fourth five-year plan to allow for a period of consolidation of the economy. Thus there were annual plans for 3 years during 1966-69. By the late 1960s it was realized that the economic policy followed that far had not been able to reduce poverty, the poor had not gained much from industrialization. Therefore, the fourth five-year plan, 1969-74, laid special emphasis on removal of poverty as one of the important objectives. During 1973-74 there was a major global hike in crude oil prices, as we see these days, in 2005-06 that increased our imports bill considerably. Our exports were not enough to pay for our imports. This led the Indian government to restrict the use of foreign exchange. Controls on import of goods, even on machineries, were imposed to conserve foreign exchange. Self-reliance became one of the major objectives of the fifth five-year plan, 1974-79. In order to cope with the turmoil, national emergency was declared in 1975. The excess controls imposed on people led ultimately to the fall of the Congress government at the center in 1977 and formation of a non-Congress government for the first time. The non-Congress government, however, could not continue for long. The economic crisis deepened further with drought, shortages and inflation. In 1980 there was a change in government at the center, the Congress Party came back to power. During the 1980s two five-year plans were implemented, the sixth five-year plan, 1980-85, and the seventh five-year plan, 1985-90. The growth rate in GDP during the 1980s was 5% per annum, much higher the growth rate during 1980-90. There was discontinuation in implementation of five-year plans during the period 1990-92 due mainly to change in government at the center. There was a major shift in economic policy towards liberalization since 1991. We will discuss further on the circumstances under which a policy shift took place in India in the next section. The 8th Five-Year Plan, 1992-97 and the 9th Five-Year Plan, 1997-2002, put emphasis on economic growth and creation of infrastructure. The 1990s witnessed a serious political crisis. The government at the center changed many times. Mostly coalition governments remained in power. Earlier, during 1979-80 and again during 1990-92, the change in government resulted in the abandonment of the plan prepared by the erstwhile government. Since 1996, however, such practice has not taken place. The economic reforms process has continued irrespective of which political party remained in power. India has completed the 10th Five-Year Plan, 2002-07, and the 11th Five-Year Plan is in the offing. The 10th Five-Year Plan continued the same objectives as the 9th Five-Year Plan. The 11th Five-Year Plan, 2007-12, focuses on growth again. However, it speaks of inclusive growth, that is, the growth process should not exclude the marginalized sections of society like the poor, the women and children, and the scheduled castes and the scheduled tribes. Here are a few exercises. You can pause the video at any time to go through it in detail. Here is a mind map diagram on development strategy from command and control to liberalization. You can pause the video here to view it in detail. There is a difference between plan objective and plan strategy. While objective relates to the goal to be achieved, strategy points out the path or procedure to be followed to achieve the goal. Recall that the industrial policy of 1956 emphasized on creation of a strong public sector. The objective was to develop India as a socialist pattern of society. During the 1970s the government had exercised too much control on industries. A license was required to establish a production unit. Permission from the government was required to expand production capacity or change the location of the plant. Separate permission was required if the proposal contained foreign collaboration. In many cases the government decided the prices at which certain essential commodities, for example, cement, fertilizer and medicine, could be sold. Such a policy is termed command and control policy. The policy of self-reliance pursued during the 1970s had isolated the Indian economy from international trade. Indian producers did not explore the possibility of exporting their products. There was no scope for adopting new technology developed abroad due to restrictions on imports. Import of consumer goods was ruled out. Thus Indian producers faced no competition, neither on the domestic front, due to strict licensing policy, nor from foreign goods, due to restrictions on imports. In such an environment Indian producers had no incentive for improving their efficiency. There was assured demand for whatever they produced. Thus the producers did not look into product quality. The Indian consumers also were not exposed to foreign products. On the whole, the cost of production was increasing due to low productivity. India was considered as a high-cost economy. Due to price controls and obsolete technology many firms were making huge losses. These firms, however, were not allowed to close shop, as it would make the workers unemployed. In order to protect the interest of the factory workers, government nationalized many sick units, continued production, and incurred heavy losses. Recall that in the industrial policy of 1956 it was envisaged that the core, or basic, industries would remain with the government. But over the decades the government produced everything from bread, textiles and automobiles to managing hotels. The emphasis on productivity improvement during the 7th Five-Year Plan was in response to the widespread industrial sickness. Another crucial development during the 1980s was the problem of public debt. The government provided subsidies to farmers, consumers and exporters. It also nationalized many sick units to protect employment and incurred losses. The government mechanism was expanding rapidly, which required higher government expenditure. The scope for generation of revenue, though taxation was limited as tax rates were already too high. In order to carry out such expenditure the government resorted to huge public debt. By the year 1990 the Indian situation was chaotic and there was a financial crisis before the government. In order to cope with the situation the government changed its position in 1991. The new economic policy declared in 1991 brought in an atmosphere of economic liberalization. Reforms were carried out on the following three lines. 1. There was emphasis on privatization. Existing loss-making public sector units were sold to private firms. Licensing policy was scrapped and no industrial license was required to produce except for 6 strategic industries. Such measures increased competition in the economy. 2. The restrictions on foreign trade were removed. Import of machineries helped Indian producers to increase their efficiency. Import of consumer goods increased competition further and made Indian producers quality conscious. The government reduced import duties to encourage imports. In turn, Indian producers aimed for higher exports. 3. The government earlier controlled interest rate and foreign exchange rate, both were kept artificially low. During liberalization these controls were scrapped. As a result, the exporters got true market price for their exports. The borrowers also paid the real cost of their borrowing. You may be surprised that in the wake of liberalization, in 1991, there was a sharp rise in interest rate. Still there was a sharp increase in investment. Similarly, the value of foreign currency increased sharply. As interest rate increased in India there was inflow of foreign funds. Earlier banks were the only source of funding for investors. Financial liberation led to emergence of stock markets as an important source of funding. The liberalization measures helped India to come out of a crisis situation. As mentioned in the beginning of the unit, India has been able to maintain high growth rate. Economic liberalization has integrated India with the world economy. India is looking forward to world markets for selling its products. Instead of self-reliance, there is emphasis on foreign trade, both exports and imports. There is no need for restrictive foreign exchange policy as India is in a strong position with efficient foreign exchange reserve. Here is a mind map diagram on developments in certain sectors of the economy. You can pause the video here to view it in detail. Industrial development. As mentioned earlier, at the time of independence industry had hardly come up in India. There were very few industries. Shortly after independence, on 6 April 1948, the government came up with an industrial policy that emphasized the need for continuous increase in industrial production and its equitable distribution. It also pointed out that the government should play an active role in the development of industries. After the first 5-year plan was over, the government came up with the Industrial Policy Resolution of 1956, which remained a benchmark in policy formulation for the next 35 years. The Industrial Policy of 1956 drew upon the directive principles of the Indian Constitution, which states that the state shall strive to promote welfare of the people by securing and protecting as effectively as it may a social order in which justice, social, economic and political, shall inform all the institutions of the national life. Secondly, in 1954 the Indian Parliament accepted socialist pattern of society as the objective of social and economic policy. Thirdly, it was felt that in order to accelerate growth and speed up industrialization it was necessary to put emphasis on heavy industries and machine-making industries. Thus emphasis was laid on development of iron and steel, non-ferrous metals, coal, cement and heavy chemicals. Keeping the above factors in view it was suggested that the public sector should be expanded. A strong public sector would create employment and reduce the possibility of concentration of wealth in a few hands. Thus public sector was viewed as a tool for containing regional and interpersonal disparities. Industrial development. The excessive control over industries through licensing policy had many adverse effects as mentioned earlier. 1. It restricted competition among firms as new firms could not enter into the industry without a license. 2. The licensing policy led to corruption as it was in the discretion of the bureaucrats to issue licenses. 3. Industries found it difficult to expand capacity and determine product price leading to higher cost of production and losses. 4. There was no incentive to improve productivity and product quality, a command and control policy regime. As mentioned earlier, there was a change in policy during the 1990s. The licensing requirement was removed except for 6 industries that include manufacture of hazardous chemicals, alcoholic drinks and pharmaceuticals. Foreign equity participation up to 100% is also allowed in many cases. Now a person can set up an industry without taking permission from the government so long as it does not degrade the environment. The industrial growth during the post-reforms period, however, has not been too encouraging. During the period 1991 to 2006 industrial output has grown at a rate of 6% per annum, which is lower than the growth rate seen during 1980-90. Agricultural development. Food grains production in 1950-51 in the country was 51 million ton while population was 1,359 million. At that time there was some scope for bringing in more area under civilization in order to increase production. Such possibility, however, was fast getting exhausted due to scarcity of land. Moreover, in the absence of irrigation facilities, agriculture too much was dependent on monsoon, which was quite erratic by nature. During the 1960s the situation got really worse when India suffered 2 successive droughts, 1965-66 and 1966-67 in many parts of the country. In spite of large-scale imports of food grains, the deficiency could not be met. Moreover, import of food grains was a drain on precious foreign exchange reserve. In order to meet the situation, the option before the government was to increase agricultural production by increasing the yield of crops. Luckily, around that time there was a breakthrough in agricultural technology in developed countries in the form of high-yielding varieties, HYV, seeds. These seeds were capable of absorbing a lot of chemical fertilizers in irrigated condition and gave very high yields. The government of India immediately adopted this technology. In order to maximize output, the government focused in areas that had assured irrigation, electric power, good roads and a dynamic farming community. The government provided seeds and fertilizers at subsidized rates. The new agricultural strategy really worked, particularly in the case of wheat in the initial years. The euphoria was so strong that it was termed Green Revolution. During the period 1967-68 to 1981-82, wheat production increased on an average by 5.2% per annum, largely due to increase in yield. Agricultural development. Secondly, when the yield of wheat increased compared to other crops, there was shift in cropping pattern in favor of wheat. Area under jowar and bajra cultivation declined when more and more land was devoted to wheat cultivation. In later years, particularly during the 1980s, yield of rice also increased substantially. During 198-1-82 to 1991-92, rice production increased on an average by nearly 4% per annum, again largely due to productivity increase. The impact of Green Revolution on different sections of society and geographical regions has not been uniform. Farmers in the wheat-growing areas, particularly Punjab and Haryana, got the benefits in the beginning. Traditionally, these areas are not suitable for rice cultivation. However, when high-yielding variety, seeds and rice were developed, these two states switched over to rice cultivation. Groundwater being the major source of irrigation in these areas and rice cultivation being water-intensive, the water table in these areas has gone down. This has resulted in the drying up of tube wells and current cropping pattern has become unsustainable. Hive seeds are sensitive to water and chemical fertilizer. It means, if we supply more fertilizer in the fields, of course, up to a limit, agricultural production will increase. The cash-rich big farmers could exploit the situation and poor farmers could not. Due to short duration of the crop and insensitivity to light, means you can cultivate these crops any time of the year, the farmers could go for multiple cropping in a year and get higher income. Agricultural laborers also got benefited as the demand for labor increased. In spite of the fact that Green Revolution has spread to all parts of the country, there are many farmers who have not been able to reap the benefits. We still find the prevalence of obsolete technology in agriculture in many parts of the country. Agricultural development. Since 1991, the growth rate of food grains production has been quite low, about 1.8% per annum. Recall that this growth rate is almost equal to the population growth rate of the country. Thus, per capita availability of food grains has not seen any improvement during the 1990s. Researchers find that there is a slowdown in the rate of capital formation in agriculture, that is, building of irrigation capacity, land improvement of permanent nature, etc. The amount earmarked for agriculture in 5-year plans is being diverted towards subsidies to farmers and consumers. An example of agricultural subsidy is procurement of wheat and rice by the government. You may have observed that government purchases food grains at higher price from farmers during harvesting season, stores it in godown, and sells it to consumers at cheaper rates through fair price shops, part of the public distribution system. You can make out that if you buy a commodity and sell it at a lower price, you will incur loss. On the same logic, when the government buys food grains from farmers at a higher price and sells it at a lower price, the government has to divert funds from other activities. Here the movement has two objectives. 1. To pay remunerative prices to farmers for their produce. 2. To make available food grains at cheaper prices to the consumers, particularly the lower income groups. In this process, the government has to incur some amount of subsidy. Subsidy can be given not only on output but also on inputs. For example, the government purchases fertilizer from producers and sells it to farmers at lower price. The objective of the government in this case is to encourage farmers to use chemical fertilizers so that agricultural production will increase. International trade. India opted for an inward-looking policy prior to 1991. It means that production of goods was mainly for domestic market. Also, production of goods was undertaken through inputs and technology available in the domestic market. Foreign trade, both exports and imports, was not emphasized. Imports were made when it was absolutely necessary, that is, if inputs or technology were not available locally. Indian exports were limited to raw materials and primary products. Exports of industrial goods were not possible, as Indian goods could not compete in the world market. On the whole, foreign exchange earning was a real constraint. Before 1991, the movement determined foreign exchange rate. Most of the times, this rate was determined not on the basis of demand and supply considerations. The government had kept the exchange rate lower than what should have been. As you can make out, in such a circumstances demand would always be higher than supply. In order to check the demand for foreign exchange, there was strict bureaucratic control. One had to obtain permission from the government to issue foreign exchange from a bank. Apart from the bureaucratic hassle involved in the scope available for corruption, such a policy was discouraging exporters. When you export some product you receive payments in foreign currency, say dollars. As per government rule you are required to sell these currency to the government at a lower price and be a loser. Moreover, when you need to buy foreign exchange towards payments for your imports, you have to obtain license and, maybe, pay bribes for the same. This policy led to large-scale black marketing in foreign currency. The exchange rate in the black market was higher, which was beneficial for both the sellers and buyers. International trade. In 1991 the government left the foreign exchange rate to be decided by the supply and demand conditions in the market. The government did not intervene the exchange rate, except through buying and selling of foreign currency just like other buyers and sellers. Permission from the government, except in certain cases, was not required. It encouraged the exporters to increase their exports as they got true worth of their exports. It also facilitated importers to buy foreign exchange from the market and import foreign inputs and technology. In addition, the government allowed foreign investors to participate in Indian stock market, which brought in foreign exchange. The interest rate in India, for quite some time, was higher than interest rate in developed countries such as the United States. The Indian government was giving higher interest rates on foreign currency savings deposits by non-resident Indians. News. The restrictions on foreign direct investment were also removed. The combined effect of all these put India in a comfortable position so far as foreign exchange is concerned. Here are a few exercises. You can pause the video at any time to go through it in detail. Here is a mind map diagram on social issues. You can pause the video here to view it in detail. Despite the rapid growth in GDP in past years and a newly perceived optimistic outlook, several problems remain to be taken care of. Many persons, who are able to work and willing to do so, are unemployed as there is no demand for their labor. Even educated youths find it difficult to find a job suitable to their qualification. You may have observed that poverty and unemployment are closely related. If a person does not find a productive employment, that is, a job which gives him/her remunerative wage, his/her income will be low. If other family members are also not employed, and if the family does not have other sources of income, then the family will remain poor. Unemployment leads to wastage of resources. The person could have been engaged in work and some output could have been produced. Thus, at the national level, unemployment means a loss of output. At the personal level, however, a lot of social stigma and psychological trauma are associated with unemployment apart from the loss of income. In India about 26% of the total population, 30 crore, people are below poverty line. That means 1 in every 3 persons is poor. Poverty line means a level of income that is just enough to meet the food requirements of a person. The above definition of poverty line is criticized on the ground that it does not take into account other requirements of a person such as clothing, housing, education and health. Thus when we talk of the families who are below the poverty line, we mean the families in abject poverty, the families who do not even get adequate food to eat. The spread of poverty is not uniform throughout India. There are some states where the percentage of population below the poverty line is very high, while in others it is comparatively Indian development low. You can make out that in India poverty is lower in the developed states and higher experience in backward states. In India the level of development is not uniform throughout. Some states have higher per capita income compared to others. The developed states have better infrastructure such as roads, hospitals and schools. Moreover, people in developed states have better access to electricity, drinking water, health services, and telecommunication. On the other hand, backward states suffer from many problems: lack of rural roads, drinking water supply, electrification, schools and colleges, hospitals, and telecommunication. Somehow, poorer states do not have adequate funds to invest in infrastructure. Their production base is low. It means that industries and service activities have not come up in these states. Agriculture still contributes a high share in state domestic product, SDP, in these states. You may be aware that agricultural income in India is not taxed. Therefore, the backward states do not have enough scope to generate tax revenue. It works as a vicious cycle. The backward states do not have enough revenue to undertake government expenditure. As a result, they do not have better roads, electrification, schools, hospitals, water supply, etc. As majority of population are poor, they do not have demand for modern industrial goods. The lack of a market for these goods and the shortage of skilled manpower discourage entrepreneurs to set up industries in these states. The state governments do not generate enough revenue due to lack of industries. If we examine the experience of the states during the past 20 years, we find that the rich states are getting richer while the poor states are getting poorer. In other words, the disparity between states is increasing. During economic liberalization, the richer states have been able to attract more investments, and grown faster. On the contrary, the poorer states have not been able to reap much of the benefits. Their growth rate is relatively low. In addition to the growth in regional disparity, there is increase in interpersonal disparity in recent years. The rich have become richer while the poor have not been able to increase their income. There is a general feeling that the poor have been excluded from the growth process. In order to tackle this problem, the 11th Five-Year Plan, 2007-12 focuses on inclusive growth. It means that the growth process should include the left-outs, the poor, the unemployed, the economically backward, and the marginalized sections of society. Here are a few exercises. You can pause the video at any time to go through it in detail.